In this video, we're going to be talking about problem 1B in the 2024 AP Computer Science test. I'll go ahead and read it. You can go ahead and skip to when I actually start solving it if you've already read the problem, but here we go. So this one says to write the simulateManyDays method. The method uses simulateOneDay, so that's that method we wrote in part A, to simulate numBirds birds, or a bear coming to the feeder. So that's this first parameter that's being passed in. We're going to be passing that into simulateOneDay when we call it in simulateManyDays. On at most numDays consecutive days. So that's a second parameter that's being passed in here, numDays. The simulation returns the number of days that birds or a bear found food at the feeder. And then we have a few preconditions. So numBirds is going to be greater than 0, and numDays is going to be also greater than 0. Let's go ahead and write some pseudocode. Let's think about what we want to be doing here. Basically, based on the value of current food, we are going to be simulating one day with numBirds for numDays consecutive days in a row. Okay, so and then as soon as we find that there isn't any food left, that current food is equal to 0, we are going to return the number of days that birds or a bear found food to eat. Okay, so let's assume that right off the bat, current food is 0. So that means that we won't be able to simulate any days, right? Birds or bears will not be able to find any food. So we're going to, right off the bat, we're just going to want to have a simple case that checks for this. And if there isn't any food left, we're just going to return 0 days because the birds or the bears could not find any food. If there is no food left, return 0 days. No food left, let me say in current food. That's an instance variable, return 0 days, okay? Once we've established that there is actually food and we haven't returned 0, what we can do is we can go ahead and loop over the number of days that we want to simulate. Okay, so that's going to be, we're going to be using that numDays. Okay, so what do we want to do within this loop? Well, we're going to want to simulate a day with numBirds. And then after we've simulated that, what else do we want to do? Well, remember that we're trying to figure out how many days birds or a bear found food to eat. So at this point, we want to again check if current food is 0. So if we ran out of food, then what do we want to do? We want to return the current day we're on. And that's basically all that we want to be doing inside of our loop. If we make it outside of that loop, it means two things. It means that we did not run out of food yet, otherwise we would have returned here. It also means that we were able to simulate the full number of consecutive days that were being passed in as a parameter. So here, we can just return the number of days we simulated. And that should be it for our pseudocode. So let's go ahead and actually implement this code. One thing to also point out is it doesn't matter if we wrote simulateOneDay correctly in part A. We can assume that it works, and we can assume that we can call it and it will give us the correct answer, which I think is pretty nifty. So even if, say, you weren't super confident in your answer for part A, go ahead and just assume it works. All right, so the actual code. If there's no food left in current food, return 0 days. So if current food, and I'm referring to this instance variable here, is 0, what does that mean? That means we were not able to simulate any days, so we're going to return 0. Otherwise, we're going to loop over the number of days that we want to simulate. So we can do a while loop. I prefer a for loop, just it makes a little bit more sense to me. You can also write it as a while loop, whatever works for you, but I'm just going to use a for loop. So you might be tempted to say like for int I equals 0, I is less than numDays, I plus plus. You might be tempted to have that be your bounds. Why is that incorrect? Okay, so we're using I to keep track of which number of days in numDays we are currently looking at. And so if we simulate a day with numBirds, and then let's say we ran out of food after that first day and we return the I that we were on, we're going to be returning 0. And 0 would not be the correct answer. The 0 case is if there was no food to begin with, not if there was no food after one call to simulateOneDay. So we actually want to have our lower bound start at 1, so that if we run out of food on that first day, after we've already simulated a day, then when we return I, we're going to return 1 instead of 0. So since we bump up the lower bound, we're also going to have our upper bound include numDays, right? We're simulating a day from 1 to numDays, including numDays. So if numDays was 5, we'd be simulating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that would be 5 total days. All right, so let's continue with our code. So we're going to be simulating a day with numBirds. How do we simulate a day? Well, we wrote a method for it in part A. So simulateOneDay. Remember that it asks for a parameter. Lucky for us, that parameter was passed into simulateManyDays. So that is simulateNumDays with birds. SimulateOneDay with numBirds. Cool. If we ran out of food, how do we determine if we ran out of food? Well, we're going to once again check if that equals 0. If we ran out of food, if it equals 0, we're going to return that current day that we're on. Remember that we're using I to keep track of which current day we're on. So that would be return I. And that should be it for the logic inside of our loop. Once we exit the loop, there's 2 things we can assume happened. We made it through all of the number of days that we wanted to simulate. And the second thing we can assume is we didn't run out of food during those consecutive days. Otherwise, we would have returned here and we would have never made it outside of that for loop. So once we're outside of that for loop, we can return the number of days we've simulated, which is numDays. We were able to find food in the feeder for numDays consecutive days. And that should wrap it up for our code. So let's go ahead and please do not move on to the next problem without testing your code. Let's go ahead and look at the first example call. So this one, we start off with 2,400 grams of food in the feeder, and we call simulateManyDays with 10 birds and 4 days. 10 birds, 4 days. So let's go ahead and run through our logic. So if current food is equal to 0, so 2,400 does not equal 0, so we don't return 0 as our number of days that birds or a bear could found food to eat. Then let's go ahead and set up our for loop. So for I equals 1, 1 is less than or equal to 4. So with this example, it's just going to tell us what happens after you run simulateOneDay. We don't really care about the logic in simulateOneDay. We just need to make sure that our code works with this example. So after we call simulateOneDay, it looks like it lowers current food to 2,100. Okay, 2,100 does not equal 0. So we don't need to go into this if statement, and we can go ahead and increment our I. So now we're on day 2. We're going to simulate another day, and it looks like that leaves 1650 in our feeder. 1650 does not equal 0, so we're going to go ahead and increment our I again. So now we're on day 3. This third day, that leaves 1,500 grams of food in our feeder. That does not equal 0. So we can go ahead and increment our I again. It looks like we're on the last day that we need to simulate 1 day of. So it looks like after we call simulateOneDay, we have 1,260 in our bird feeder. 1,260 does not equal 0, so we don't return I, and then when we try to increment our I again, we get 5. 5 is no longer less than or equal to 4, so we're going to exit our for loop, and it looks like we can return 4 as the number of days we were able to simulate, and that is the number of days birds or a bear found food to eat, and that exactly matches up with the expected value. All right, the next example, it says we start off with 250 grams of food in the feeder, and we want to simulate ManyDays with 10 birds and 5 days. So we check whether current food is equal to 0. So 250 does not equal 0, so we will not be returning 0. We're going to move on to the for loop. We set up the bounds of our for loop. I equals 1, I is less than 5. That is true, so we go ahead and go into the for loop. We're going to simulate 1 day with the 10 birds, and it looks like after that first day, it leaves 150 grams of food in the feeder. 150 does not equal 0, so we're going to go ahead and continue looping. So increment our I, it's now 2. After we simulate the second day, this does actually leave the feeder empty. So now current food is equal to 0. So when we check if 0 is equal to 0, it does equal 0. So we're going to be returning the current day that we're on. We are using that I variable to keep track of that, and that is 2 right now. So here, birds or a bear were only able to find food to eat at this feeder for 2 consecutive days. And then since we return that, that is the answer that we would get for simulateManyDays, and that is exactly the expected answer. All right, final example. This one, we start off with 0 grams of food in the feeder. That might not be great for our birds or a bear. So we try to simulate this. We simulate many days with 5 birds, 10 days. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but since current food is equal to 0, what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be returning 0. The birds or a bear were not able to find food at this feeder for a single day. So yeah, we would just be returning 0 here, and that matches up with the expected value. Here's our final answer. Like I said, you could have used a while loop if you wanted to. I just prefer the for loop. It makes a little bit more sense to me. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.